Native American creation myths. Why study Native American creation stories? Too often, the discussion of American literature and American history begins only with the European settlements in the Americas. To do this would ignore that the Americas had millions of people living here and complex cultures before 1492. While much of their cultural stories were not written down, we have some of their stories to this day. Therefore, this week we are reading two creation stories that were passed on from generation to generation among the Seneca and Cherokee Indians. Most Native American tribes had rich oral histories that were passed down from generation to generation. Some of these tales were written down by European settlers, but their stories existed for centuries beforehand. The oral traditions of the Native American tribes were generally of a religious or spiritual nature and often served as morality tales. Most are unconcerned with logic, or whether such events could have literally occurred, as with most religions. The Native American creation myths were generally written down by Christians in the 1800s or 1900s. So some of these tales may have changed due to the writer's perspective on creation or divine forces. Also, by this time, many tribes would have come in some contact with Christian missionaries, so their stories may have adapted to conform more to Christianity so as to avoid being seen as clearly heretical. When analyzing these stories, and the creation stories or myths among many cultures, we can better understand them by recognizing a common underlying structure called the monomyth. By 1900, many anthropologists began to realize similarities between different oral traditions in many cultures that had no direct contact with each other. In the 1950s, Joseph Campbell developed the concept of the monomyth, a predictable storyline which showed up in most or all of these stories. Here's the basic structure. In a monomyth, the hero begins in some troubled wasteland. This concept of a wasteland is a time period or a place in which there is some kind of corruption or lack of hope among the people. This is usually preceded by some time in which everything had been perfect, like the garden in the biblical story. The hero, who is almost always a male, has an identity problem, not knowing who his real mother or father is. Somehow the parent's power is passed on to the child, but without knowing his parents, he cannot know his potential or his power. The hero recognizes his innate power by displaying a greater consciousness or alertness. The hero does not accept the wasteland. He then encounters a mentor and decides to perform some difficult task. The quest motif usually occurs here, where he undertakes to save or redeem the wasteland. He ultimately meets an obstacle that he can't overcome and is defeated, often in death. But he is reborn and now changed or fully realized. This is often seen in him marrying, and there is a return to a utopian existence, a return of the garden. While this structure is just for one kind of monomyth, the quest myth, there is also a similar pattern for creation stories as well. The structure of the monomyth can be applied to many different stories across various cultures, from Greek myths to biblical stories to the King Arthur stories to Star Wars to many Native American myths and many more. These story patterns are called archetypes. Psychologists tell us that they probably derive from archetypal dreams, which may be somehow built into the human brain, and are shaped into stories by culture, often through people sharing their dreams and turning them into an oral tradition. The dreams are often had by many people, coalescing to connect the details into a unified story. An important point to note, so many creation myths worldwide contain many of the same symbols and similar storylines. This seems to reinforce the concept of some universal archetype.